Hey guys, so before we get into today's video, I just want to say that I don't think you will find a more serious and rigorous scholar of theology in the church than Blake Ostler.
What Joseph Smith is teaching, as I take it, is what Jesus was teaching in John 14 through 17, this kind of mutual glorification.
Blake is the author of the Exploring Mormon Thought book series and podcast with the same name, which you can find on Spotify or iTunes. Blake is fluent or semi-fluent in 9 languages, including Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Egyptian. He will take any reader or listener on a serious, rational exploration of our theology and doctrine. So be sure to check out his book series, Exploring Mormon Thought, and or subscribe to his podcast under the same name. Awesome. And yeah, and I wanted to preface anyone who's watching this with that both you and I were talking beforehand that where I have very serious issues with certain things that Dan says, many things that he says are brilliant and are right on the money and are quite insightful when it comes to, I always say kind of a lot of the times he gets the facts correct, but he gets the interpretation of those facts that come off a little off key. And so I always want to kind of tell people that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and think just because Dan McClellan or because anyone else says something that, because they say some things that are false, that means that everything they say is false. And I would say the opposite also. Just because people say things that are true doesn't mean that they sometimes will have some bad ideas.
That's in my area, my field of practice, we adopt what we call the rule of charity. We engage an author's strongest arguments, not their weakest arguments. If we can find a saving interpretation that would make their argument stronger than they've made, we're obligated to give it. And we ought to treat, and because, I think we all believe in this, we ought to be charitable with people. I think that we ought to treat people the way we'd like to be treated. And so, the interest is in fairness and giving someone the benefit of the doubt, but being honest with what we're dealing with, maintaining integrity.
So Dan he has a TikTok channel that's blown up. And essentially what he does in these TikTok channels is that he has people who are not biblical scholars, but that are online, talking about the Bible, kind of spouting off. And then he comes in as sort of I'm the expert. Let me rip it all apart for people. And it's kind of this mismatch between some dude who listen to something from his pastor against someone who's actually trained in biblical scholarship. And so Dan comes off looking rather tough because, when you're a professional boxer and you're going around the amateur, junior leagues, punching people in the face, you kind of look like a big tough guy. And so,
yeah, one of the things that I do have an issue with Dan is he's constantly calling out these non-scholarly, people who are just basically giving their views without, the kind of educational background that Dan has. And he's always pointing out, he points out, there's an individual who starts out by pointing out the dictionary definition of bigotry and prejudice. And Dan comes on, what I think about the dictionary fallacy and the etymological fallacy. and there are such fallacies. And in fact, he is committing such fallacies. Then Dan goes on to use the definition as a basis for his own critique. And so, but Dan is committing the straw man fallacy big time here. The straw man fallacy is the fallacy is where you take a weaker argument and disembowel it, but you haven't accomplished anything because there's a stronger way of presenting or a stronger argument out there. And so you really haven't touched it, but you give the impression that you've dealt with the argument. And that you're the expert, you know what it is, and these people are nincompoops, have no clue what they're talking about. And so it's kind of taking advantage of a power structure where he has a PhD and they don't. Mm-hmm. And so he's taking advantage of I'm smart and they're stupid, and I've got the credentials to prove it.
Yeah. Which maybe is a bit of an authority fallacy unless he provides a good coherent argument where people are expecting people to take his word for it because he has the PhD. Where frankly, I grant some authority to PhD, but I expect a PhD to give a really good argument. Sometimes Dan does. Not always.
Yeah, sometimes he does, but what I'm saying is there is there's a certain cachet that is purchased simply with the notion that I'm an expert and they're not. Mm-hmm. And he's not taking on experts, if he really wants to take on experts, then he wouldn't be taking on the people that he's taking on. He would be taking on people like Robert Gagnon or Gagnon, depending on how you want to pronounce it, because I speak the other languages. Gagnon is French, and that's kind of how I say it. He'd be taking on Richard Davidson, a number of other scholars. He wouldn't be taking these people on at all. And he ought to be taking on Boswell. He ought to be taking on Gagnon. He ought to be taking on people who speak his language. And so, he's scoring cheap points in my view.
Well, I want to welcome Dan onto this show anytime. I think it'd be great for you two to have a discussion on my show. I would love to even have a discussion with him. I'm not an expert, but I think I know enough that I could hopefully be able to intelligently address some of the things that he's saying. And so Dan, this is an open invitation. If you're watching this, you're welcome to come on and have a discussion.
We're going to be talking about a person who ostensibly is a Latter-day Saint. And I want to treat him with due respect. I also want to preface it with this. We're going to be talking about a subject that I consider to be high TNT for a lot of folks, very close to the heart of some, and difficult for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I have very good friends who both are and who have children who are in same-sex relationships and marriages. I have people in my own family, and I love them. I support them. And the last thing on earth I want to do is to make life more difficult for them. And we're going to be talking about, essentially what Paul and Jesus are saying about same-sex relationships, active homosexual relationships. And I just want to say, and we can get, we'll talk about this when we get to Romans 1. Paul is quick to point out right after he lets people know that homosexual active sex, sexual relations, penetrative sex is not in accordance with the nature that God intended, that we all suffer from our own problem of sins. Okay. We all have more than enough repenting to do. And so if we're going to be calling someone out, we ought to also take a good look in the mirror because, none of us, we don't have the right to judge. And I'm an attorney and I know judges, they get paid to judge. And until somebody pays me to judge, I'm not doing it. Just not worth it. I don't, sure. I want to extend the recognition that all of these people are brothers and sisters. They're all children of God. And in my view, my job is to love them, not to judge them, but it's also to accurately reflect what I consider to be a divinely inspired message. That's different from the way Dan treats the text, by the way. He doesn't consider it to be authoritative or inspired at all. In fact, he considers it to be contrary to being inspired. He considers it to be harmful. So,
hey everybody, this is just a brief reminder that the sexual ethic of the Apostle Paul has no relevance to today, and Christians already reject the majority of it anyway. There are really only a couple of main points that are still preserved: abstinence before marriage and condemnation of same-sex intercourse. And those are preserved not because this is God's will or because the Bible says so. They're preserved because they have become convenient identity markers, and they have become useful in the structuring of power and values in favor of the identity politics and the boundary maintenance of the relevant groups.
So the argument that same-sex intercourse is at least in part sinful because it cannot result in the production of offspring is absolutely something that we find in a handful of Greco-Roman period Jewish texts that are not in the Bible. And it's certainly in the background of some of the legislation regarding sex in the Hebrew Bible. But we find a complication in the New Testament. And that complication is that several authors do not care at all about procreation. In fact, Paul and the author of Matthew and the author of Luke directly advocate for celibacy as a higher ideal, as a more righteous way of living. Now, they recognize that not.
Yeah, that's comment about that. This is an argument that Dan makes over and over again. He's telling us that Paul's view on homosexuality is irrelevant because we don't really trust Paul at all on what he says about marriage and sexuality. We've negotiated away in his terms any notion of celibacy that Paul taught. And so if Paul was wrong about celibacy, he's also wrong about homosexuality. Now, that's a logical fallacy in and of itself, okay? It's a false dichotomy. It's also a hasty generalization if it's meant to be an inductive kind of an argument. And so he's now engaging in another logical fallacy. And to boot, it's just factually wrong. People should read all of 1 Corinthians 7.
Okay.
This is basically rising because of debate that existed between the Cyrenics and the Stoics. Stoics believed in marriage. There were other Greeks who believed that marriage was not good because it detracted from a person's ability to focus on studies and things like that. Okay, so and apparently some of the saints at Corinth had adopted that view. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And Paul says, but that's not going to work because of sexual temptation. And here's where he says this. This is very important, okay? Each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Because of temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. That's the general rule. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Now, this is revolutionary that a woman would have conjugal rights. Mm-hmm. And likewise, the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, and this is revolutionary, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does.
I'm going to pause just for a second because people need to stop and know that is an unbelievable thing to say within the context of the Roman world where women were totally subordinate to men, and to say that a man has any sort of subjugation to his wife of any kind like that, this is wild stuff. Like,
oh no, it's radical. I mean, it's off the charts radical. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I think we should stop. It's something that's very important to recognize that Paul is seeing this kind of mutuality in sexual relations between a husband and a wife, and the general rule, each should have a husband and a wife. Okay. Now he's going to continue. Now is a concession, not a command. I say this, I wish that all were as myself, but each has his own gift from one of one kind and one of another. I want to break this down. What he's saying is, I'm going to kind of summarize what I've said before, and I'm going to kind of give you this exception. I wish that all were as myself. It's presumably that's celibate. But whatever your own gift is, notice the word gift here is the same as the word that was appearing in Matthew. And only those who have this gift are to remain celibate. Now, what is the gift? The gift is to preach like Paul does. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it's good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, Dan is constantly making a big deal. In fact, he caricatures what Paul is saying here by asserting that Paul sees sex as lustful, that should be passionless. You know, you go and you lay on top of each other and hopefully something happens, apparently.
Paul was a dogmatically celibate man who thought everyone should remain celibate, and you should only get married if you could not hack celibacy. And if you did get married, your sex could not be passionate, because the passion of desire was for the dirty, dirty Gentiles who did not know God. Christian sex was to be holy and was to be honorable, and the point was prophylaxis. Paul, because of Greek philosophical frameworks, thought of sexual desire as a problematic product of our base material existence that we had to overcome. And so you had to keep a tight lid on sexual desire. desire, and sex within marriage should only happen enough to screw that lid down tighter. So it was to be passionless and prophylactic and rare.
But that's not what's being said at all. What Paul is actually saying is that passion should be kept within the bounds set by God. In modern parlance, a wife should not be objectified as a sex object, and neither should a husband. And it's important that they maintain an honorable relationship with one another. Now, who wants to disagree with that? Now, if you caricature it the way that Dan does, in the ancient world, they were really concerned about this kind of run amok passion. We shouldn't have a passion in marriage, is what they're saying.
Paul says it's better to marry than to burn, and that means to burn with sexual desire, because sexual desire was considered corrosive and problematic, which is why he said, even if you did get married, you should possess your vessel, and that means men, you should possess your sexual receptacle, your wife, in holiness, in honor, and not with the passion of desire, like those dirty, dirty Gentiles who don't know God.
So I think the thing that really got me as I watched that was his notion that not only that sex is supposed to be, passionless, but that he kind of painted it as though Paul was making it out that man is supposed to possess his woman, his, sexual receptacle. When it's like you just pointed out in the verses, it's very clear that Paul actually is talking about something quite different, which was a sort of a sexual
reciprocity.
Equality and reciprocity that certainly would have been radical for those days. So he does seem to be missing the point there. Any other thoughts?
It's not only that, he's saying sex should only happen to the extent necessary to satisfy sexual desires, right? That's not what he's saying at all. Paul actually expressly states that those who are older, who can't have children, engage in sex. He recognizes the sheer reality that, in fact, we're sexual beings and we have desires. And if we don't satisfy those desires, we're going to be subject to temptation. It's just a given human reality. Mm-hmm. So what he's really doing here is caricaturing Paul. There may have been those in the Greco-Roman world who actually, and the Jews kind of saw it this way, because remember, there were sexual prostitutes in like the temple to Moloch. There were in the temple to Aphrodite, where they would have orgies and their passions were run amok. And of course, the Jewish writers didn't approve of that. The Stoic writers didn't approve of that either, and they approved of marriage. Yeah. But there's nothing in Paul suggesting that he limits sex to simply satisfying the man's need. That's just false. The text doesn't permit that reading, is what I'm saying. It's this kind of mutual reciprocity and mutual honoring that he's actually talking about. And it's revolutionary. And so he's caricaturing Paul in a way that I think doesn't do justice to Paul. And those dirty, dirty Gentiles, it's really the dirty, dirty right-wing people that he wants to denigrate. But we'll move on.
They could not have cared less about procreation because they thought Jesus was coming back too quickly for that to be a consideration anyway. That's why in the Gospels we have, woe to those who are found with child at the second coming. Not going to go well for you. So what does that mean? Don't get pregnant. Don't have sex. Be celibate. Live a higher law. So this argument doesn't work once we get to the New Testament.
I hate that you kind of put in there like live a higher law, and it seems clear that seems to be an extrapolation he's making, not necessarily based on our understanding of the context of that particular time.
Yeah,
because
well,
obviously, if it doesn't make any sense, like if God wanted us to be totally celibate, like all the time, that would just lead to the end of humanity.
Everybody recognizes that, but they also recognize, he says he wants it for everyone, but it's clear he doesn't want it for everyone. He recognizes that only very few will be able to do this, and that the general rule is that people should be married. I want to put this into some perspective, Paul, because what Paul's really doing is he's adopting kind of an interim view. And the interim view is in light of the fact that we have an imminent parousia, or the return of Jesus. And because the time is so short, people should remain exactly as they were. So in verses 17 through 24, he's saying, whatever circumstance you were in you should remain in that circumstance, because there's just not time to really do anything but build the kingdom of God. So everybody who can should go out and preach the gospel, because Christ is coming back and we've got to prepare the kingdom for him. Now, I want to put this into perspective in light of Jeremiah 16. The reason I want to put this into perspective is this is another crisis type of a recommendation, saying that no one should have sons or daughters because of the impending disaster. So in Jeremiah 16, God is warning Jeremiah about the fall of Jerusalem that's about to happen. 16:1. Then the word of the Lord came to me. You must not marry and have sons or daughters in this place, for this is what the Lord says about sons and daughters born in this land, and about the women who are their mothers and the men who are their fathers. They will die of deadly diseases. They will not be mourned or buried, but will be like dung lying on the ground. They will perish by the sword and famine, and their dead bodies will become food for the birds and the wild animals. So Paul's admonition regarding being married in this interim period, while we're waiting for Christ to come with the imminent parousia, is the kind of thing that Jeremiah is talking about. And it's really this interim kind of an ethic. And so it really this is what has no application to us. And he's definitely not saying everybody should be married. He's saying, no, you don't do anything wrong if you marry. And notice he says, but because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each her own husband. And he's recognizing in the backdrop of the command that people should marry, he's saying that in this interim period, this command is suspended in a sense. Okay.
Yeah. Because of the basic idea is that because of the imminent nature that he had of the second coming, he kind of saw it the way Jeremiah did and said, hey, things are going to get really bad. Let's just kind of keep things where they are. If you're going to have sexual relations within marriage, that's fine. But, because we are sexual beings, but like, let's not try and have a bunch of babies right now because things are going to get really rough.
Yeah, they're going to get really bad before they get better. But something even more, Paul is saying, I want people to be like me. The rationale is that we're in an interim period with the imminence of the parousia. And so we have a different rule that applies. We have to go out and do missionary work. And I don't want you distracted by families and wives. It's that simple. Mm-hmm. So how is that relevant to us now? It isn't. It's exactly the opposite of what he asserts. He's asserting that we can't trust Paul on celibacy because it's not applicable to our time. He's right. It's not. The argument isn't applicable to our time at all. That's not what Paul teaches. Elsewhere, Paul specifically teaches about the man and the woman and how they should be united. And so the notion that Paul is teaching that we should, he hopes that everybody will become celibate. That's just false on its face. That's not accurate.
If your translation of the Bible says the word homosexuality or the word homosexual anywhere in it, it is 100% a mistranslation.
Mm-hmm. It's not like there weren't people that they recognized had a proclivity to prefer people of the same sex, okay? It's not like homosexuality simply didn't exist in the ancient world, so they just didn't notice. Mm-hmm. That's not the case. But what is the case is that as far as Paul is concerned, what's at issue is not this proclivity. It's not this desire at all. It's the acting out in behavior that's at issue. And that's why it's not homosexuality that's at issue. And that's the way Paul recognizes it. So what we have in 1 Corinthians 6, this is again from the NIV, and I'm going, this is 6 and 9, if you want to pull that up.
Got it.
Okay. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor greedy, nor drunkards. And it goes on. Practice of homosexuality is recognizing that it's not just a term that is a fixed orientation. They're practicing. the footnote C, the two Greek terms translated by this phrase refer to passive and active partners in homosexuality.
Do you know what the Greek term is that's used here in 1 Corinthians? Is it arsenokoitai?
So rendering homosexuals for arsenokoitai is 100% a mistranslation. It does not refer to all people who identify with a homosexual orientation. It does not refer to all people who engage in acts of same-sex intercourse. It doesn't say a word about women. It doesn't even refer to all men who engage in acts of same-sex intercourse.
Arsenokoitai is the term for an active, and I don't think it really means an active participant. I think what it means is a man who beds another man. Okay.
Yeah, because
I think they're reading into the term something that isn't there in the text. That is the cultural background from the Greco-Roman world, but that's not what Paul is referring to. Paul is in fact referring to the prohibitions on homosexuality in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20.
And just to go to this word, right? Because it doesn't say homosexual. They have it translated. You know, I've seen it in various translation. Men who have sex with men who practice homosexuality. But there is a focus on this the act, and it specifically. But the word, if we go back to the actual Greek that's used, is arsenokoitai, which is basically two words put together. It's not an actual just like word that they had out there. It was as if Paul created this word as
right. This is
a man better.
Yeah, but it very clearly refers to homosexual penetrative sexual activity. Okay, it's the behavior that's in question, and it's not referring to a status.
So rendering homosexuals for arsenokoitai is 100% a mistranslation. It only refers to men who take the active role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. And the word just before that is rendered effeminate, malaki, that refers to men who take the passive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. And it's no accident that Paul has two different categories for the people who take these two different roles. They had no concept of a versatile role. Men either sought out the active role or men sought out the passive role. So why did they consider it sinful if procreation obviously wasn't a consideration? So the best we can do with the available data is observe that Greco-Roman period Jewish and Christian authors thought that same-sex intercourse violated the socially constructed hierarchy of domination and penetration that was salient throughout the Greco-Roman world before, during, and after this period. It was considered unacceptable for a free-born male citizen to take a submissive or a subordinate role in an act of sexual intercourse, even with another woman. And I've talked about this in a number of videos. As late as around 1000 CE, we have people talking about how it was considered unacceptable for a woman to be on top and a male to be on the bottom. And we see that in some rabbinic literature. We see it in ancient Mesopotamian literature. And that social hierarchy is no longer relevant.
The argument that all he has in mind here is this hierarchy of dominance. Paul's actually using both terms to show that he's not talking just about a passive partner. He's also talking about men who have the action of going to bed with other men, essentially. But he's also, if you've got it, we can bring up the quotes in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20.
Yeah, because there's that word that he makes up, arsenokoitai, which is basically to bed a man,
right?
And that's
notice that our word coitus comes from the kotin here, the kotai.
Oh, so when we say coitus, that's from the same.
Yeah, it's from this Greek word.
And so it's basically man coitus.
Right. Well, coitin means bad. Okay.
Yeah. But we all know, like, if I say I'm taking my wife to bed, people generally have an idea of what that means.
It was very clear even in his day. This is euphemism referring to having sexual relations. Okay.
I see. So he's using that sort of language.
It's very clear that's what he has in mind, because it's a male. It's a male, like with a female. Okay.
Yeah, and like you're saying, so if someone was to look at this word arsenokoitai and be like, oh, well, where does this come from? Where did Paul come up with this word? Because if I'm not mistaken, it isn't a common word that's used out there. He basically was drawing, if I'm not mistaken, from Leviticus. He literally was using the words from Leviticus to create this new word.
I think there's a near consensus, and by that I mean most scholars, not just the people that I like to read, that Paul actually has in mind Leviticus in this particular passage. And now let me point out a few things. The passage just before Leviticus 18 and 22 talks about idolatry. And there are scholars who want to say, well, he doesn't have in mind homosexual sex with men in general, and he certainly doesn't with females. He's not forbidding females. What he has in mind is cult prostitution sex that they would have in their temples. So it's a form of idolatry. But if you look at the rest of the chapters, it is outlining the types of human relationships that are not permissible. And this is one of those relationships. The reason that this is the case is elsewhere in the law, it ties, in Deuteronomy in particular, it ties the sexual desires that are out of bounds to idolatry. Okay, and that's why Paul is doing the same thing here. He's not using this in the way that, oh, I intend to limit it just to cultic prostitution. That's not what he's talking about. It's not limited that way, but it doesn't extend to females expressly in this text. Now, there's good indication that by the time of Paul, it was intended to include females. He would have understood it that way. But at least I think the way that it is written, and recognize Leviticus is written in Hebrew, not in Greek. This is from the Septuagint translation of the Masoretic text of Leviticus, okay? So what we're getting here is just the Greek translation, and Paul often quotes from this Septuagint text. This is the text that he used when he was quoting the Bible in a Greek context. And so what he's talking about here is the word that he's using in 1 Corinthians 6 is, and you can see the words are right next to each other in Leviticus 20. Arsenos and koiton are right next to each other, and it is forbidding homosexual sex. It's impossible that Paul didn't have this in mind when he's speaking in 1 Corinthians 6, okay? However, it doesn't mean homosexuality. It is forbidding homosexual sex, but let me point out another thing. He says it's an abomination. He's going to give the death penalty in Leviticus for this act. None of us believe that homosexual sex merits the death penalty. The verse that's immediately before it talks about the death penalty for having a sex with a woman during her menstrual period. Okay. Nobody's going to buy into that. So the mere fact that it occurs in Leviticus, but the early Christians adopted a hermeneutical rule that those parts of the law that Christ quoted or relied upon remained in effect. And later Christians in the first, second centuries, if they could show that Paul was relying upon it, that also was still applicable in the law. That was their kind of hermeneutic as to what they were going to see as applicable to Christians. Okay, so it's this kind of a use that Paul is relying upon in 1 Corinthians 6. So I want to agree with the critics that it doesn't mean homosexuality, and it doesn't mean homosexuals. Nobody is condemning homosexuals merely because they're homosexual. It's practicing homosexuality that's at issue. But you have to recognize that the terms that are being used here, they do mean, the second term that's being used here means effeminate. It means a person who is passive in a sense, okay? My view is that Paul is using both of these terms to show that he's going beyond and rejecting the existing Greco-Roman view that it's passive sex alone that is at issue. That's why he coins this new word, because he wants to make sure that they understand that it's not just the passive partner that is dishonored in homosexual sex.
Which is exactly kind of the opposite of what Dan is saying, where Dan is trying to say that Paul is just upholding this Greco-Roman notion that it's wrong to be the submissive one, but it doesn't say anything about actual homosexuality, or homosexual acts in general. It's just certain types of homosexual acts are wrong. But
right.
And for those who kind of go down the sort of, he was talking about prostitution or something like that, or like I've heard people say that, he was only referring to like the Greek practice of older males having sex with young males or boys like that. But there were words for that. And this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, like pederastia.
The word malakoi can be translated as effeminate. Okay. It can be translated as passive. It can be translated as, limperist in vernacular, something like that.
Yeah.
That's kind of stereotype of the weaker homosexual partner. But he's saying nor adulterers, nor malakoi, the effeminate, nor the arsenokoitai. And that means people who practice homosexual acts. So he's applying it, and he's being much more expansive than just the malakoi or just the relationship. He's saying that none of these are going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He's not saying, and the construction doesn't allow to say that it's the arsenokoitai who are taking advantage of the malakoi. Okay, that's not what he's saying. That's not a word allowed.
The word seems to expand the idea when in Greek there already were other words that he could have used if he wanted to use a narrow thing and say just pederastia is wrong, or just heterai, I think is how you say it, the term for the male prostitutes. So there were specific terms he could have used, but he didn't. He used this broad term that he got from the Septuagint, which says you don't have sex. Men should not have sex with each other the way that, the way female and males have sex with each other.
Now let's drive this point home even more, because I now want to look at First Romans. Okay. Or Romans 1, I should say. There's no First Romans, there's just Romans. Beginning in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the ungodlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth of their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the worlds, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so the people are without excuse. Now, what Paul's actually talking here, and I don't think that Dan recognizes the profundity of what Paul is actually saying here. What Paul is saying is that people engage in self-deception. They actually know the truth, but they're hiding the truth from themselves. So they both know what the truth is, and they also disbelieve the truth of it. And it's what we would call self-deception. Now, there's a very large corpus of philosophical literature on self-deception and what it is. And in my second volume, I address self-deception and its relation to the human cognitive condition. But it's important to recognize that that's what he's talking about. 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. So this is the real problem. They have darkened hearts. Their hearts are no longer open to the truth. That's the real core of the problem here. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. So Paul is going back to this well-established theme that whenever one departs from God, it's a form of idolatry, okay? And what they are doing is they only look at what is sensuous for human beings to see. What Paul's really saying here is they're only relying on their senses for what they can see to be true. And this is a very profound recognition, I think, in epistemology, you know, we recognize in modern categories that we have people who rely only on sense experience. David Hume would teach this, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, he's kind of saying that he's saying that, you know, there are people out there who just rely on sort of the natural world and the natural man. They worship the works of their own hands. They're not in touch with God, is kind of the way I see what he's saying.
That's what he's saying. Now, Dan caricatures this.
But let's get to Romans 1. This is Paul attempting to explain how the Greco-Roman world got to be the way it was. And Paul starts from the idea that God is manifest in creation. Therefore, anyone who can observe creation must know enough about God to be responsible for adequately worshiping God. And because the Greco-Roman world worships idols and worships the works of their own hands and animals who are God's own creation, they are knowingly abandoning proper worship in favor of worship of the created. And so in overturning that created natural order, they are abandoning God. Therefore, God is removing these restraints that were placed on their natural passions and everything so that they're allowed to run wild, resulting in such extremities as same-sex intercourse and a bunch of other things. And it is entirely inaccurate. That is absolutely not where same-sex intercourse comes from. And the attempt to deploy Paul's misunderstanding today as an explanation for where homosexuality comes from is misguided and phenomenally harmful.
Even now, notice how he is going to include women in what he's saying here. Even their women exchange natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. And we're going to come back to these words, natural and unnatural. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, what's interesting here is that Paul is avoiding the entire division between arsenokoitai and malakos. He's not addressing that at all. As a matter of fact, the term he uses for males, arsenes or arsesin, is the term that is derived from the Septuagint 1 Genesis 26. It's the term for male and female that he's adopting here.
So in this, what we have is that Paul is abandoning the categories that Dan is saying of this, you know, dominator versus, you know, the penetrator versus the penetrated, and it's bad for a man to be the penetrated side, which was a conception that existed in the Greco-Roman world. However, he's abandoning that entire framework and saying, look, there's an order that God has created, and those who have disconnected themselves from God now are giving themselves over to these shameful, disordered behaviors, exchanging the way God intended for these sexual, powers to be used for ones that go against not what the natural man is. I guess there's a distinction that needs to be made between, just because Dan makes this argument that like, oh, well, you know, now we know that homosexual behavior is natural. And yes, it's true that if it occurs in nature, sure. And in nature, animals murder each other. What we're talking about is he's talking about the nature that God intends for human beings via the endowments that he gave us of sexuality, and that they are natural within the celestial order, the celestial nature of those endowments that we've been given. And so Paul is talking about that sort of a natural order, a celestial nature, rather than sort of just nature as in animals doing their thing.
Now, the other factor that was salient anciently was the notion that same-sex intercourse violated what nature intended, went against the natural order. We know that that is not true anymore, that same-sex intercourse and same-sex attraction are things that occur naturally. They are not choices. They are inevitabilities.
Notice how he smuggled in and enlightened two concepts here: same-sex attraction and same-sex sexual acts. He's saying they're not a choice. It's not a choice for me whether I'm going to like a man. I don't have that choice, okay? And so I can recognize there are people who don't have that choice. You can do anything you want. I'm not going to like being with a man. I'm just not built that way. And I imagine that those who are homosexual are just built in the way that women just don't turn them on. It's just the way they are. And I can accept that. But when he says that there's no choice about homosexual sex, he's acting like there's no choice about whether you take your pants off or not. And that, of course, is absurd. So when putting the two concepts together, he's just misleading us. There is a choice about whether one engages in homosexual sexual acts. There is such a choice.
This is what happens when you create a sexual identity that then becomes part of who you are, and then they conflate, as you're saying, the acts from the identity. And to say that somebody has a particular proclivity versus whether they act on it. And I think we already have addressed that in the scripture, it seems to be concerned with the notion of acts, the actual things that people do.
And what is ironic here is that Dan himself goes to great lengths to show that the Bible doesn't have, this kind of stable sexual orientation in mind, what it has in mind. Now, there's a subsidiary argument that those who are pro-homosexual often use, and that is to say these people anciently couldn't even conceive of a committed, loving homosexual relationship, okay?
The ancient world had absolutely no concept of homosexuality as a sexual orientation in anything remotely approximating the way we understand sexual orientations today. And
that's not true. I quoted these other parts to show that they had in mind people who had a stable sexual proclivity. They called it a habit or something similar, but they did have that in mind. And it was something that the culture was aware of. And but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether it's because of a proclivity or the one just wants to be weird for a moment. What Paul is talking about is that these kinds of acts are not in accordance with what God intended. That's the bottom line.
So in the end, none of the arguments from the Bible or from the societies that facilitated the production of the Bible are at all relevant to today. They just don't carry water. And so people have to come up with their own rationalizations today for why they should obstinately hold to this belief. And I'm going to suggest that there are two reasons this still goes on. One is the more fundamental one. A lot of people feel an intuitive aversion to the idea of same-sex intercourse. It's just icky.
How does Dan know that? Has he done a survey? Is there some study that was done on this ick factor? How did they measure this ick factor? He's just pulling this off the top of his head without any data. He's now got his own dogma over data. Okay. So, is the way people think about this ick factor really true? I think we should see Dan here as saying, this is one of the reasons that I would have an aversion, and I've overcome it. Okay. I've overcome the ick factor. Because I don't think he can speak for anyone else. There's just not data there to support the kinds of assertions he's making.
Yeah, and it's a common argument that the only logical reason people don't, or the only reason people are against gay marriage and homosexual behavior is just because they think it's icky. And I think that's just a big time straw man. I'm going to let him finish here because then I want to talk about why it actually makes total sense as to why this doesn't fit into what the Lord is doing. Or into the plan. So I'll just let him continue.
For a lot of people. And because we like to feel that our intuitions are good, we will frequently bring our reflective cognition to the defense of our intuitions. And so we rationalize why we feel that ickiness. And so we come up with reasons why the way we feel is good and right, and therefore why same-sex intercourse is wrong. And the other reason this opposition remains salient is because it is either meaningful or useful to people today. And as an identity marker, it is phenomenally useful for right-wing authoritarianism, for boundary maintenance, for costly signaling, and for credibility-enhancing displays. In other words, the reason that opposition to same-sex intercourse, to homosexuality in general, is still popular among many Christians is because of identity politics.
So basically, the only two reasons he can think of why anyone would be against homosexual behavior is because of you think it's icky, or you're a right-wing authoritarian and you're using it as a tool to structure power against people that you don't like.
Yeah, and let's recognize this is its own logical fallacy, the attribution of motive as a means of explaining why a person believes something is a particular type of the ad hominem fallacy. Okay. And so, it's like saying, well, Einstein only believed in the special theory of relativity because he had a fight with his professor and he didn't like prior physics. Okay. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. Attributing the motive is irrelevant to if there's a legitimate rationale. It doesn't matter if there are a lot of illegitimate reasons. Okay. And as we've seen, there are reasons why a person who believes that Paul was inspired, or a person who thinks that Paul actually was visited by the resurrected Jesus Christ and called to spread the gospel and inspired to respond to the questions that were put to him by those that he taught. And this has been the Christian commitment since day one as a practical matter. That person may want to come to a correct understanding of what Paul is teaching to understand the order that God intended. It's the same order that Jesus taught about as we saw in Matthew. It's the order of creation. Now, those who are pro-homosexual relationship and practicing homosexuality consistent with the gospel would say that these are clobber texts. I say that the other readings they give are evasion maneuvers. Okay. and he's giving us an evasion maneuver here. And you notice who the particular boogeyman is. It's right-wing authoritarianism. Basically white supremacy, if you will. And there's a reason why Dan may see the world that way. He's doing the very same thing he's accusing those who are his foil. He's doing the very same thing he's accusing them of at this point. He's playing power politics, okay? Now, more often in his videos, what he's arguing is that, we're maintaining boundaries. This is really a power play to maintain power and authority and to make sure that things don't change. And if you listen to what he said, it's really because you want to continue to put down women. You want to continue to put down homosexuals. You want to maintain a certain power structure. That too is an ad hominem fallacy, by the way, an attribution of motive. I don't know if he even recognizes how strongly he's being influenced here by Michel Foucault, who was the original French intellectual who wrote about deconstructing texts in terms of power dynamics. But he does it constantly. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he's following Michel Foucault almost to a T, because Michel Foucault was gay. He died of AIDS in California.
Wasn't he also engaged in pedophilia?
He defended it.
Whether he was engaged in it, he justified it.
Yeah, well, I'm not. The mere fact that he had some bad ideas doesn't mean all of his ideas are bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and the fact that he might be a bad man, I mean, Beethoven wrote great music even if he was a jerk. So,
well, and I don't want to commit the genetic fallacy as we're talking about fallacies here. But I do want to point this out. Here's the thing. I can't stand that he sets up this false dichotomy of, well, it's the only reason someone could be against this is because of ick or because of politics, where it's like, no, actually, for me, it's because of reality and because of truth. Because the truth is, according to our doctrine, is that God created them male and female. And and the only way for us to hit the mark, the highest mark, as the guy at the beginning of his video was talking about, is for us to be in a male-female union. And that is just the nature of reality. As Latter-day Saints, we're actually equipped to, and it's funny because I watched recently Joe Rogan rip apart what is his name? Matt Walsh went on to talk about gay marriage. And I realized Matt Walsh, as a Catholic, is not equipped to be able to defend marriage the way that we are, because for him, this is essentially God's arbitrary sort of God. It's just an institution that God made it this way, and God doesn't want gay people to have sex with each other. Where for us, we say, no, it's part of an actual plan that God himself can't even get around. The nature of reality itself is such that the only way to attain the highest level of glory, that the law that even God has to abide, says that you have to be in a male female, the union of the masculine and feminine has to occur in order for you to reach the highest potential and participate with God in the creation of worlds without end and the great work of exaltation. And that, so we actually have, it's like, if our premises are true as Latter-day Saints, that is what exaltation requires, then it makes perfect sense that this is to miss the mark.
Yeah.
This sort of a relationship does not allow you to attain the highest level of glory.
So Paul's motivations for these things are based on social, historical, ideological, philosophical frameworks and circumstances that simply don't exist anymore. And so the majority of it has rightly been dismissed by Christians who recognize that it does not serve us anymore. What we hold on to for rhetorical purposes because it serves our structuring of power and values. And there will also come a time when those things are rejected as not for us anymore. It's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of when enough of us will decide that the utility to our boundary maintenance and our structuring of power and values is not worth the damage that it does to the lives, to the mental health, to the well-being of the people who are put in the crosshairs by the deployment of those things as identity markers.
Those who do not fully understand the Father's loving plan for his children may consider this family proclamation no more than a changeable statement of policy. In contrast, we affirm that the family proclamation, founded on unchangeable doctrine, defines the kind of family relationships where the most important part of our eternal development can occur. Fundamental to us is God's revelation that exaltation can only be attained through faithfulness to the covenants of an eternal marriage between a man and a woman. That divine doctrine is why we teach that gender is an essential characteristic of individual, premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose.
Thus, Satan seeks to confuse us about our stewardships and distinctive natures as men and women. He bombards us with bizarre messages about gender, marriage, family, and all male-female relationships.
But our claims for the role of marriage and family rest not on social science, but on the truth that they are God's creation. It is He who in the beginning created Adam and Eve in His image, male and female, and joined them as husband and wife to become one flesh and to multiply and replenish the earth. Each individual carries the divine image, but it is in the matrimonial union of male and female as one that we attain perhaps the most complete meaning of our having been made in the image of God, male and female. Nor we nor any other mortal can alter this divine order of matrimony. It is not a human invention.
God sanctioned marriage between a man and a woman has been the basis of civilization for thousands of years. There is no justification to redefine what marriage is. Such is not our right, and those who try will find themselves answerable to God.
Marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, and the family is central to the Creator's plan for the eternal destiny of His children.
In large measure, true manhood is defined in our relationship to women. The First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles have given us the ideal to pursue in these words: the family is ordained of God. Marriage between man and woman is essential to His eternal plan. Children are entitled to birth within the bonds of matrimony and to be reared by a father and a mother who honor marital vows with complete fidelity.
Worldly trends to define marriage in some other way would sadly serve to destroy the institution of marriage. Such schemes are contrary to the plan of God.
The church must retain its family-based orientation. Among the first instructions given to man and woman was, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." God, in His divine plan, ordained marriage to bring about His basic organizational unit, the family.
Regardless of what civil legislation may be enacted, the doctrine of the Lord regarding marriage and morality cannot be changed. Remember, sin, even if legalized by man, is still sin in the eyes of God. We also know that gender is an essential characteristic of individual premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose. Marriage between a man and a woman is fundamental to the Lord's doctrine and crucial to God's eternal plan. God's marriage pattern cannot be abused, misunderstood, or misconstrued. While we are to emulate our Savior's kindness and compassion, while we are to value the rights and feelings of all of God's children, we cannot change His doctrine. It is not ours to change. His doctrine is ours to study, understand, and uphold.
I've been pretty harsh on Dan. Again, I think if I went out to lunch with Dan, we'd probably be friends. I hope we would. I know we'd have a vigorous disagreement about politics. I think we agree on so much when it comes to biblical scholarship, really. Dan's done some good things, and he has a particular gift of explaining very complicated and sophisticated biblical scholarship to normal people who aren't eggheads like me. Okay, he's got this gift, and I'm not sure I've got that gift to the same extent. So I envy him for that. But still, if he's going to run out and set up a straw man so he can disembowel it with all of his logical fallacies, he's fair game.
For sure. All right. Well, yeah, I guess I'll just wrap up with saying the same thing. For anyone listening, what the scriptures teach when it comes to these issues is one debate to have, but how we should treat those who are our fellow sinners. And I say that in the deepest way. I don't place myself above anyone else who is also in this world trying to figure it out their best that they can. And know that, discussions like this, where we're talking about the nature of sin, we could go into any other number of sins that would be my sin, that I'm dealing with. And
I don't
just as guilty of those.
Your sins or my sins.
Yeah. But if we're talking about sin in general, and what does the scriptures teach about these things, I think that we've had a discussion that I hope people can come to their conclusions as to what the stronger arguments are here when it comes to what the Bible is actually saying on these issues and what Paul was saying specifically, so that we can be rooted in the truth and not in the truth of what the Bible is actually saying, or what Paul was trying to get across, based on what the best arguments are and not just on what we want it to say. So, all right. Anything else to say before we roll?
Thank you, Jacob.
So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.